Hi, folks. I'm Brett Reynolds, and my presentation is Teaching Prepositions in a Modern Grammatical Context. And the sort of framework for this presentation is the framework from our book, A Student's Introduction to English Grammar, with Rodney Huddleston and Jeff Pullum. So before I get into the context, I just want to give a little bit of background on the book. Back in 2002, the Cambridge Grammar of the English Language was published by Huddleston and Pullum and quite a large number of other distinguished linguists. And that won a lot of awards. It was very well received and very well reviewed. And a couple of years later, they put out a smaller version of the same thing. Now, obviously there's differences, but basically it's the same framework, the same chapter structure and that kind of thing. And that came out in 2005, and that's been extremely popular. It's been through 19 printings. And so finally, in 2020, during the pandemic, we started writing the third edition of this, and I was lucky enough to join them on producing this. And I'm sorry, the second edition, and it is now out in stores and online and whatnot. So there are many grammars, I know, and the idea here of the Cambridge Grammar and the Student's Introduction is not just to sort of rehearse what has traditionally been said and say it in a fresh way or something like that. It's to really reevaluate the way we look at grammar. And that doesn't mean that it's a radical departure. You'll find a lot of material in there that is very familiar, but there is also a lot of analysis. There's a lot of change, and there's a lot of good reason for that change. It's not simply because it's a different viewpoint on it. A lot of it really looks at claims that have been made that just cannot be supported. And if those claims cannot be supported, then how can we reframe that? And the case of prepositions is a just sort of an example to show you the kind of thing we're talking about. Now, before I get into the actual arguments about prepositions, I just want to sort of start with a status quo test. And so during my lifetime, I'm Canadian, and during my lifetime, people in Canada have always used pounds and ounces for weighing things. That's just the way it is. It's the status quo. And so when somebody suggests that we throw away pounds and ounces and revert to only grams and kilograms, I sometimes feel tempted to defend the use of pounds and ounces because, I know my weight in pounds, for example. Now, is this because I'm used to them? That is because it's the status quo. Or is it because pounds and ounces are better? And a way to test that sort of for myself is to think if Canada had never used pounds and ounces and only grams and kilograms, how would I feel about changing to pounds and ounces? And I think the answer is that I would hate that idea. I would not want to go in that direction. And so this is a good way to think about how we're doing this when it comes to other ideas, and in this case, the way we look at prepositions. It suggests that I have a status quo bias and I'm not thinking clearly about these issues when I want to defend pounds and ounces. And in ELT, obviously, people have certain views about what prepositions are. I'm going to suggest a different view, and you may feel, that it's up to you to defend the standard view. And as I go through this presentation, I hope you will ask yourself whether such a temptation is simply because the standard view is the standard view, or is it actually any better? In other words, if ELT had always had the view that I present here, would you want to switch to the standard view? Okay, so enough of the throat clearing. So what are prepositions? The Cambridge Dictionary defines them in this way. In grammar, a word that is used before a noun phrase, or a pronoun connecting it to another word. So this is the standard view. This is not special. This is very normal. And there's a few elements. Obviously, it's a word, right? A preposition is a word. But specifically one that's used before a noun phrase, or a pronoun. So that's very, very specific and very limiting. And I'm going to push back against that. So sometimes it's helpful to think about, a group of words by sort of listing them, and we can sort of intuit the similarities between them. And so here's, a bunch of prepositions. None of this will be surprising to you. And none of this differs in the Cambridge Grammar of the English Language or in a student's Introduction to English Grammar. We all agree about these. So what are the characteristics of these words? Is it simply that they appear before a noun, a pronoun, or a noun phrase? Or is there more to it than that? And I think we can certainly agree that there is more to it than that. The semantics, to begin with, prepositions very typically indicate either locations or relations in space and in time. Not all prepositions do, but that's a very common meaning aspect of prepositions. Now, we don't want to depend on meaning, but that's something that we can consider here. Prepositions typically do not have different forms. So if we think about nouns, think about the singular and plural form. Verbs have past tense, present tense. Adjectives have comparative, superlative. Prepositions typically do not have different forms. They just have a single form. And many of these words are just a single base with no morphemes attached to it whatsoever, although that's not necessarily the case. So what syntactic functions do prepositions perform? Well, we can look at that, what modifies them, and what kind of complements do they take. So, this claim, again, that they are followed by a noun phrase, or a pronoun, we can look at that a little more carefully. So, here's three phrases: before them, before, and before they came. And the Cambridge Dictionary defines before, in the first case, as a preposition. It comes before a pronoun, them. And so this certainly fits the Cambridge definition, and I don't think anybody would argue about that. But in the second case, when it doesn't come before a noun, a pronoun, or indeed anything at all, here most dictionaries and most grammars would say that this is an adverb. And in the third case, before they came, where it comes before a clause, we would call this a conjunction. Again, this is the standard view. So when the standard view says a noun phrase, or a pronoun, I'm just going to lump all of those together as NPs. The adverb there, the second one, has no complement at all. It doesn't have an NP after it. And the conjunction has a clausal complement. Now, here we can see another example. I left my job before him. I have left jobs before, and I left my job before he came. So an NP complement, no complement, and a clausal complement, a preposition, an adverb, and notice I put these in quotation marks, and a conjunction. All right. Now, I'd like you to consider, does the meaning of before change in any of these cases? Before him, I've left jobs before, or I left my job before he came. Meaning is a little bit hard to really get a hold of clearly, but I would suggest here that the meaning is really identical. Okay, it's in time we're thinking about prior to something, right? Now, does before have different forms? For example, does the adverb have an ly? Obviously we don't have beforely. So the forms here are all the same. It's just before, before, before. There's no change. And if there were a change, that would be a good argument for putting them in a different category, but we don't see that. Do these before phrases perform different syntactic functions? Well, I left my job when, before him. I have left jobs when, before. I left my job when, before he came. So all of these are modifiers in clause structure, or you might call them adjuncts. You could call them adverbials, but I would prefer to stay away from that, just because the question of whether it's an adverb or not is one that we're looking at. So let's not use that terminology, but let's say it's an adjunct in clause structure. Do these take the same modifiers? And are they really different kinds of words? Well, here we go. Let's think about these in terms of an analogy to verbs, right? So if we think about the verb think, think can come before an NP in the way that a preposition, like before, can come before an NP. So you need to think happy thoughts. Here we have a verb followed by an object, right? An NP. And that's very normal. We can also say you need to think. And here there is no complement at all. There's no object. And this is like the before adverb, the so-called adverb, where there's nothing after it. And then we have this example. You need to think it's going to be okay, where the complement of think is a clause, just like the conjunction before has a clause as its complement. Now, are these three different thinks, or are they one think? Are they all verbs, or are they something different? Well, no one would consider think to be anything but a verb in any of these cases, regardless of what kind of complement it takes. So we don't define verbs by their complementation type. What about adjectives? Do we define them that way? Do we find them by their complementation type? Well, no, we don't. Adjectives can take complements like I was happy that she came, I was happy about it, or just I was happy. There's different ways that we could, complement the adjective happy, but that doesn't change the fact that it's an adjective, right? So the complementation doesn't matter. What about nouns? Well, think about the noun thought, right? A thought about happy thoughts. So it can take an about preposition phrase as its complements. The thought that he was there, right, can take a clause as its complement, or we can just say the thought, right? So verbs adjectives and nouns, none of these are defined by the complement they take, and all of them take a variety of complements. So why should it be that we define prepositions by the complement that it takes and limit prepositions to taking noun phrase complements? So I'm going to argue that that is a mistake. So if we say that prepositions, just like verbs, nouns, adjectives, can take a range of prepositions, or indeed no preposition at all, I'm sorry, a range of complements, or indeed no complement at all, then that brings us to a much wider set of prepositions than we have typically thought about. Okay, so that's going to bring in some of the adverbs. It's going to bring in some of the so-called conjunctions, right? So most subordinating conjunctions, such as before, under this analysis, are actually prepositions that optionally or obligatory take clausal complements, right? And similarly, many words that have been traditionally seen as adverbs, words such as away, right? Away never comes before an NP. He went away the car, or he went away the day, or something. I suppose we have whiled away the day, but typically that doesn't happen. So away is a preposition here under this analysis. So in terms of the subordinating conjunctions, that means words like after, although, because, except, if, but only in its conditional sense, okay? Once, since, though, unless, while, etc. All of these are actually prepositions rather than subordinating conjunctions. This leaves us with only about 3 actual subordinators, and just terminologically to distinguish here, I'm going to call these subordinators rather than subordinating conjunctions. And that's the word that, as in I heard that he did it. And this is always pronounced that, right? This is not that, but that. I heard that he did it. Whether, I wonder whether he did it. And if, in the non-conditional sense, this is interrogative marker, I wonder if he did it, where it means essentially the same as whether. Now there are a few other arguable ones, but these are really the main ones here. Okay. Earlier I mentioned that we could look at modification. So far I've really been considering the complement type, but what about modification? Because, words like nouns are modified by adjectives and not adverbs, right? And words like adjectives are modified by very, whereas verbs are not modified by very. So, we can that can be useful in classifying these words. So we can look at very here, and we can say that very modifies all these adverbs, very much, very well, very quickly, very often, etc. But very doesn't modify these words as prepositions. The ball went very in the hole. On the other hand, right does. And right would not typically modify adverbs. So we wouldn't say write much or write well or write quickly, at least not in standard dialects. Now there are dialects that do say this, and it's harder to tell there. But in standard dialect, that doesn't happen. So we don't see this with prepositions, and when we get a preposition like aboard there, where we have, traditionally this has been called an adverb, but it doesn't act like an adverb because it can't be modified by very. but it can be modified by right. So that suggests to us that this is really a preposition, not just because it's sort of similar in the meaning, but also the type of modification that it allows. So we have the function, right? The job was quickly, doesn't work, and quickly is an adverb. I am carefully, doesn't work. Carefully is an adverb. The problems are often, doesn't really work. Often's an adverb. But what about preposition phrases? The ball is in the hole, perfect. I'm with a client, perfect. They are aboard. Now, if this were an adverb, we would have to explain why can this function as the complement of be. But if it's a preposition, then it just follows naturally that it does. And I think clearly it is a preposition. Adverbs, phrases don't typically function as complements in put VPs. So put it quickly, put it carefully, somebody put it often. No, none of these work. Preposition phrases do work there. Put it on the desk, put it in your pocket. And when we say put it down, it also works. Now, down here doesn't have a noun phrase after it. So traditionally it would be called an adverb, but this tells us that it is actually a preposition. Adverb phrases function as pre-modifiers in verb phrases. Prepositions don't. And here, the word here, the word inside, the word away, these would all be considered adverbs, but they can't work here. Okay. So far this is just a grammatical argument. So what? Why would you adopt it? Who cares? How can this help? Well, as I've sort of tried to show you, there are some regularities here. And these regularities, when we teach grammar, that's what we're teaching. We can teach just vocabulary, individual words, but when we're teaching regularities, that's what we're teaching, is we're teaching grammar. And these are the regularities that we can use when we're teaching prepositions, and we can lean on them, and they are useful to students because, that's the whole point of regularities. You don't have to learn case by case. You can just learn the general rule. So we can explain to students, for example, when a student writes a sentence fragment, such as because I was late, the explanation that you often hear is you can't start a sentence with a conjunction. But this is a lie, okay? We can, and we do all the time. It's very common. All writing, because I was late, I wasn't able to get a seat is a perfectly fine sentence. A better explanation is to tell them, well, this isn't a sentence, it's just a preposition phrase, right? And it's similar to after 9 o'clock, and you wouldn't write a sentence like after 9 o'clock, right? So it's useful in that kind of analogy. And we can also answer students' questions like, why is it that some conjunction plus clause combination can be placed either before or after the main elements of the clause and others cannot? And, if it's really a conjunction, then this is a puzzle and this requires explanation. But if it's a preposition phrase, that's just normal. That's the way preposition phrases work. And we see that all the time. So the traditional view of prepositions is that is the one that's familiar to most teachers, but it involves needless complexity. There's special begging, there's special rules for certain words. It works for this, it doesn't work for that. There's all these exceptions. It misses all sorts of regularities. But the view that I present here is one that is much more regular, much more consistent, and much simpler, okay? And we may feel that that is harder because it's new to us, right? As teachers, we're familiar with one way of thinking, but this is the status quo bias that I sort of warned you about at the beginning. So I hope you will consider this with an open mind And I hope that you will dig into A Student's Introduction to English Grammar, because it has many more nuanced views like this that will actually simplify the way you think about English grammar. And it will reduce exceptions, it'll simplify the overall system, and it will make learning easier for your students. So I hope you will reject the status quo and realize that this is not actually a better view. If ELT had always had this view that I'm presenting here, I think and I hope you would want to keep that. I would be very pleased to take your questions. Obviously, I can't do this in a recorded session, but if you email me at brett.reynolds@humber.ca, or you can follow me there on Twitter. The first one is more not so much grammar stuff. The second one is obviously grammar stuff, and I hope that those are interesting to you, and I hope to hear from you. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.